All right, got it. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Really excited to convene today's session. This is the QPI volunteer preview of something that's been in the works for quite a while, and that's the Quiet Parks International Assessment Criteria. We're going to really dive into some of the technical and more direct ways that you as volunteers can become a lot more engaged than you currently are and expand upon your current voluntary involvement with our organization for current projects or in the near future. And we're really excited to bring together a few members of our team. Some of you are also dialed in too, so we're looking forward to hearing some comments from you in the chat section, which if at any time you have any questions or would like to raise any comments or suggestions, please forward them to the chat section and we'll refer to them and review them during the Q&A at the end of this discussion. But you'll be joined by myself and Nick McMahan today in this discussion. We'll give some brief introductions now. You can also follow those QR code links to our various SoundCloud pages. Shameless self-plug there for the recordings that Nick and I have undertaken over the past few years. But my name's Ethan Bourdeau. I'm the Executive Director of Standards and Outreach for Quiet Parks International. Been with the group for the better part of 2 years at this point, helping facilitate the development of new standards, emerging awards and certification categories that we've been looking into. We'll discuss some of that at the very end of this presentation to give you a sense of where QPI is headed with various initiatives and different types of things that are on our radar going into the next few months and few years. But for now, I'll pass it over to Nick to give a brief introduction, and then we'll dive right into some of the assessment criteria.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Ethan. I'm Nick McMahan. I'm the director of Quiet Trails, and yeah, I've been a part of Quiet Parks for a little over a year now. I think early last year, I kind of joined on more intensely, working with organizing these Quiet Trail assessments. But I had been doing some volunteer stuff with Gordon and Matt, doing Quiet Wilderness volunteer assessment in like Glacier National Park, and spent some time with Matt at the American Prairie area, which I don't know if that actually has been awarded yet, but is in the process, and is a very wonderful and quiet place. I think that's about it for me.
Cool, great. We'll hear more from Nick a little bit later when we talk more about the Quiet Trails program that he's been the director of for some time now, and we'll get a sense of how that program has been maturing and developing over the years. But before we get to that, I'll just give you a rundown of today's agenda. We'll have a quick primer on sort of the 101 with Quiet Parks International, what QPI's main mission is, what we're about, how things may or may not have changed since the last time you've been in touch with us. We'll talk then about the assessment process. We'll go into what the higher level look at the various stages of assessment are starting to shape out to be, to learn more about the formalities of what we at Quiet Parks are really expecting from volunteer input. We'll then go over some best practices. This is like an evolving series of lessons learned, things to consider when you begin engaging with managers, stewards of land and parks, and things of that nature, based on a few years now of some pretty interesting and colorful assessments, I'll put it that way. Then we'll dive into equipment needs really, really quick. This is, again, another broad recommendation, and in some cases, a requirement centric approach to how certain programs work. We'll look closely at the Wilderness Quiet Parks. I believe our Executive Director of Wilderness Quiet Parks is on the call too. So if I blunder or make any mistakes there, he will hopefully jump in and correct me. And Urban Quiet Parks as well, where we'll talk about the current state of assessment for both of those programs. Then we'll pass it over to Nick. We'll learn a little bit more about Quiet Trails, especially some exciting projects that are beginning to wrap up on our end here in the States. And then some closing and Q&A sections. So this will take the better part of the next 45 minutes, and we'll try to keep some time open for question and answer towards the end. So some background for those of you who are new to the group, which if you are, welcome. Very excited to have you. Quiet Parks was established in 2019. It's an organization that has been dedicated to saving quiet for the benefit of all living beings. For those of you who may have been familiar with One Square Inch of Silence, this group has been one of the many things that have blossomed out of that initiative. And since that time, we've learned a lot more about what some of the needs are internationally, how we can best approach the ideas of preservation, conservation, and education with quiet. There's a number of efforts that are stemming from that soon to come. We understand that quiet is a multisensorial experience, demanding elements of oral tranquility, visual privacy, accessibility, and minimum olfactory comfort. It's not just about the sound level, it's not just about the sound quality, it's truly everything that factors into that tranquil experience, which extends beyond the oral senses. So this plays a huge factor in how we as assessors carry ourselves and understand and take note of potential candidates for quiet parks. The documents that you'll see here in the interim standards and assessment criteria outline the program's criteria and testing requirements specific to each of QPI's program offerings. I'll note that we're really only diving into 2 or 3 of those programs. There are a few other certifications that we are working on that I'll discuss at the closing section related to quiet stays, residences, communities, quiet conservation areas, which will be the subject of future volunteer meetings. But for the sake of time, we're going to move forward with some of the more commonly assessed and awarded programs, such as urban and wilderness. And then lastly, QPI is organized into board members, officers, advisors, and representatives with experience in acoustic ecology, environmental activism, acoustic engineering, accessibility, and scientific research. It's a really holistic group of interested individuals. It's now expanding to the university and academia levels as well, with folks who are interested in exploring acoustic ecology. And throughout, and something I hope is an exciting takeaway from this discussion is there seems to be a need for and a desire to have more structured methodologies with acoustical ecology assessment. And it's my strong opinion, and that of many others on the QPI board, that this can be the place to really start honing a more advanced look at how crowdsourced and volunteer-based assessment can help usher in a more scientific and meaningful approach to gathering acoustical ecological data for the sake of preservation and education. So exciting stuff ahead. We'll move now into the process. This is something that we've been working on for the past few months to understand a simplified way to approach assessment for quiet parks. And that includes 6 categories here, which are nominate a park, selecting a park, verifying a park, analyzing that data, awarding it based on the findings and your collaboration with QPI, and then maintenance, which is a field that I believe deserves its own presentation as well in the future. We won't dive too much into how some of these parks will be maintained because we're exploring some potential technological advances with continuous monitoring and acoustics through some burgeoning partnerships that we're looking into in that particular field. So we have minimum requirements per program based on each of these categories that we'll talk about specific to wilderness and urban. And each of those sections will be broken up into at least the first 5 of these, and we can briefly discuss what maintenance can look like for some of these programs. As mentioned, we do have this at this time flexible but strongly encouraged best practices guidance, which really, again, stems from lessons learned, the understanding that maybe not all spaces are, I'll say, as accessible as they may seem, and that there are limitations to the efforts of our program when we consider existing legislative regulatory elements related to noise pollution that may impact your region or locale. So as an assessor, it's important to refer to some of these key themes and recommendations. And I should note here at this point, we will send out a copy of this presentation and the recording after this. So if there's anything here that you'd like to refer to in the future, don't worry, we'll make sure this is in your inboxes moving forward. So a couple of things to consider, just email chains, making sure that when you're communicating with managers and stewards of parks and locations, just important to have those permissions, any endorsements, and especially any funding that's associated with your involvement of assessing and nominating certain parks, tracked via email. This is important for us at QPI to just understand, how do these conversations happen? Who do we need to be in touch with? A lot of these managers change hands quite a bit, so it's important also to have email chains to then, if the communication breaks down, you can then send that over to the next step up and tell them that this conversation has been happening. So it's simple record keeping elements here, especially with receipts. If for any of your assessment, you've been working with us to secure some form of funding, or if there's any reimbursement involved with your approved reimbursement involved with your assessment, of course, tracking receipts and then sending those in to us will be very important to ensure that your assessment is properly reimbursed, and in addition to any funding that you may have from any existing organizations that you're working with, like land management, et cetera. Safety is very important. All Quiet Parks International candidates need to be safely accessible and free from non-natural hazards that may put visitors or QPI assessors at risk of injury. This is very important, as silence and inhabitability, I just made that word up, I'm sure, sometimes go hand in hand, but those do not a safe place make. Things make a safe place make. So it's very important to really ensure that as you nominate, and especially before you visit, do make sure that safety is the #1 priority. Quiet is a very interesting thing to chase after and record and acknowledge, but we want to make sure that as we award, we want to provide opportunities for people that do not put them in harm's way. So that's more of an obvious best practice, but something to keep in mind. Time, make sure that as you do work with us, this is sort of a new formality. There is a Clockify account that we'll send a link to, where we would hope that you could log your hours for working with us so that we can understand what average times and durations of assessment are looking like for assessors, especially in the case of areas where you are being funded on an hourly basis for your work as an assessor. So this is a new process for us, and we'll send some links and maybe some best practices for how you might go about reporting some of these in a follow-up email and message to the volunteers. And lastly, for award, when presenting the award to qualified park candidates, ensure that the messaging has been sent out to all relevant land managers, stewards, and stakeholders prior to any formal announcement. This is definitely important when we think about communications and media opportunities where we can highlight your work and QPI in general. Just making sure that all folks are involved, because as we've learned in the past, these are moments that land managers really want to take to celebrate and acknowledge the amazing natural resources and splendor of the landscape. So it's always just great to make sure that everyone's involved, even if it means things take a little bit longer to get to that award process and onto the QPI website, for instance. Now the fun stuff, the equipment. This changes and varies based on the programs, such as wilderness, urban, quiet trails. But there are a few elements that do remain consistent, such as stereo microphones. We do encourage that external microphones are used, but allow for equipment that is portable, handheld, and may have internal microphones. We just ask that as you commence your assessment, you make note of the equipment that you're using and ensure that it meets the minimum audio recording requirements, which for the most part is a 96 kilohertz 24-bit audio minimum requirement for WAV files, which are submitted at different lengths per program. So wilderness quiet parks would ask for a longer length recording than, say, an urban quiet park, for instance. That can, of course, again, be a handheld device. It can be a digital recorder with external microphone inputs. Really, the sky's the limit there. We definitely encourage things like spatial audio, as long as it can be brought down to a stereo file that we can share in the future, if possible. GPS may be obvious, especially in the wilderness categories and quiet trails categories, to make sure that we have the actual coordinates for where you've undertaken certain tests. Sound level meters are very important for this. We'll talk about some of the minimum requirements for logging when we think about metrics such as the noise-free interval and looking at 1 second logging or less as a minimum requirement. I'm happy to answer any questions about sound level meters offline too, if that's something that you and your team have questions about. And then there's these combination dual channel assessment devices such as song meters, which QPI has just gotten our hands on a few. We're excited to test some out and see how these might be applied to future assessment. So stay tuned. We're going to potentially look into developing some case studies or not, depending on how well they work. And Gordon Hempton, one of our original founders, was insistent that I include digital or physical notes as a key important element to assessment of quiet parks, which, as I mentioned at the top, the sound element is important. The acoustic and audible demonstrations of sound in these spaces are very important, but also the physical notes related to your experience are as important, if not more in some cases, to assessing and understanding the true quiet and describing in your own words the tranquility associated with these spaces. So notes are a vital element as you assess and as you experience parks. So that is something that we strongly encourage, and to the extent that you can, be as verbose and as detailed and descriptive as possible when you submit those. So now we'll dive into wilderness quiet parks in particular and learn a little bit more about how this program works from the sense of the various stages of assessment. We have a few QR codes listed throughout as well. So if you do at any time see some of these, they're usually associated with certain links. So we have this at the bottom. If you're interested in nominating any particular quiet space, you can visit that link and you can submit the information that we're asking for at that sort of website portal. But wilderness quiet parks candidates, for those who are not familiar, are presented to QPI via various participants, including our own volunteers, sometimes park management themselves, government or regulatory officials, residents of certain parks, as well as QPI advisors and board members, since we're often in the field and looking around for places ourselves. And we review them with the various QPI program directors, which Matt Mikkelsen, who's on the call now, is the director of Wilderness Quiet Parks. And we, like I mentioned, all nominations can be sent through our website using the link that's at the QR code below. And we look for a few things here. We need your name or the name of the person who maybe manages the land and is curious to explore this particular award. We are looking for the site name and location. Google Maps links are fine. GPS coordinates are even better if there are certain locations exactly that you believe are worthy of assessment. Description of quiet, there's a 1,000 word limit on this, but we again would ask for as detailed and as detailed rich response as possible when describing the quiet, focusing again not just on sound or noise, but also the presence of a peaceful sense or a tranquil environment beyond just acoustics. A 5-minute minimum stereo audio example is highly encouraged, if not required for some instances, just to give us a sense of really what does the space currently sound like. I think it's important to mention, while obvious, that these should be unedited and truly raw files if possible. But if the only audio examples that you have are from files that are edited, these can be accepted. Just please note those in the description that this is coming from an edited source and it's not raw. And lastly, indication of available budget. If you have found yourself in the position of possibly nominating a park under the guise of an organization that could be willing to sponsor or fund QPI assessment, that's obviously very important for us to understand so that we can then loop in as many volunteers and resources as possible from our end, from QPI. And if funding is needed or if there's any additional support, that is also important for us to understand so we can make sure that you feel supported in the field. So going from nomination to selection involves a few things, including approval from the executive director of Wilderness Quiet Parks after reviewing what you've submitted during the nomination process. So selection does involve a few physical geographical elements, such as proximity to residential areas, industrial zones, transportation corridors, of course, as well as airplane and watercraft traffic. The extent that other recreational activities, such as off-highway vehicle usage, may create noise throughout the park. So to the best of your understanding, being able to relay that based on those activities. Terrain, topography, and other natural features that may affect how noise travels in the area. Natural features in this case could also include things like running water, waterfalls, elements that may produce noise, or sorry, produce sound, very important distinction, may produce sound, but are not necessarily contributing to that sense of the tranquil environment that we're looking for wilderness quiet parks. And then data collected by land management agencies. So for instance, if these parks in question have worked with noise control experts, noise pollution assessment agencies, if that data is publicly available, it is important for us to review in advance, understanding that that data changes frequently with changing weather patterns, traffic patterns, industrial development. So as much of that information that you can provide to us as possible, the better when we choose to select and move forward with what is the verification process. This is the bulk really of why we have these criteria to begin with. Is the verification is very detailed and differs per project. So without going into too much detail with each of these, some of the most important things that stand out with the Wilderness Quiet Parks assessment is determining the noise-free interval, or the NFI, which is a 15-minute duration of time specific to wilderness quiet parks, where anthropogenic sound or noise is not readily present, as measured by a logging sound level meter and the dual assessment of audio recorded at that location. So this would be an overlay of acoustic sound pressure level data to spectrogram visualizations showing that the predominant sounds at any given time within those 15-minute intervals is natural and human and not human generated. Or is exhibiting any signs of presence of industrial or transportation noise as well. So these are measured within various assessment periods, in this case, 2 hours before sunrise until 1 hour after sunrise during an average day, which is 3 out of 5 days of testing. So we strongly encourage that a week at minimum of testing occurs for a wilderness quiet park. This can be remote if that time is not easily afforded. Where you can set up remote acoustic logging and audio logging, sometimes joint or dual channel monitoring for a week's time. And from that week's time, you can pull 3 consecutive days. Or Matt, maybe this is when you jump in. Consecutive, not necessarily being an option. You can choose 3 of those 5 days. Is that correct?
Yeah, can you hear me all right, Ethan?
Yes, can you just fine?
Just fine. All right, yeah, I'm just gonna come on just audio because I'm a little sick, so apologize my scratchy voice. Yeah, for wilderness quiet parks for the testing period, what's kind of the ideal situation is, yeah, you go set up gear, leave it for a week, and then we can kind of look at all those days. It's nice to be able to see what the activity is like on a weekend compared to a weekday. Because yeah, different activities can happen on weekends versus weekdays. But we really like to see within a week, 5 days to a week's worth of time, we want to be able to dependably say there is a 15-minute noise-free interval during a testing period. So yeah, having those days, all those testing days happen consecutively if possible is really great. Of course, things happen, like weather happens and we have to take a day off from testing or something like that. But yeah, we really want to be able to dependably say without a doubt, there is a 15-minute noise-free interval in this site.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Oh, you can go.
Good.
Cool. Well, so that is part 1 of the verification for wilderness quiet parks. And unless we have a question in here too about time of year, we can answer that towards the end of this. In terms of equipment for verification, we mentioned those devices at the start. I also mentioned the WAV file format specifications, which ideally would be more at the higher range. If there is an issue with space in recording at that high rate, that sample rate and bit depth, please reach out to us too, because if you are willing to assess for longer periods of time, we can definitely acknowledge WAV file formats that are a lot easier on the SD cards. For sound pressure level meters, we are looking for meters that offer logging at the 1 second or less interval. If we strongly encourage that these are type 1 class A certified sound level meters. But again, if any needs or cost issues arise with that, you can always reach out to us and we can come up with alternative solutions if cost is an issue or renting is not an option in your area. Camera is very important. The sight and sound synergies are very essential for us to remotely assess and verify and award parks. So as many photos detailing, again, that element of tranquility beyond just the aural and sonic elements of the landscape will be very important for assessment. Wilderness Quiet Park Assessor documents, which are always available to you, are made available through the executive directors of each of these programs and are being updated all the time. So that would be a document that I would encourage if you're interested in assessing a wilderness quiet park to reach out to Matt for the latest in terms of how we're currently tracking that. It's usually in Excel format where we copy and paste links to various geospatial data, audio files, sound pressure level data, etc. So those exist for all most of our programs. And then lastly, for verification under wilderness quiet parks is the methodology. So we are looking for your team to be composed of at least 2 to 3 qualified field technicians, which we will refer to a document that has not been released yet, but we're working on to describe what those qualifications would entail. It's essentially going to fit under our best practices guideline to look into what the minimum requirements for assessment would be for this program. The minimum data collection period is 3 hours per day for 3 days in a given week, as we mentioned before. It must happen in a 7-day period. We mentioned some of these in the last section about when these tests should start. Weather should be calm and clear during the testing period so as to avoid any disruptions to the transducers in your microphones or the acoustic assessment in your sound level meter. Should be relatively free from constant environmental noise, flowing water, or geological features, as we mentioned before, which may cloud or mask the otherwise tranquil or natural environment. And again, those field notes describing the perception of quiet are as essential, if not more essential in some cases, than the physical data and audio files that you'll capture on site. So photos should be provided, which show the following, which is your recording equipment, your sound level meter setups at each location, the predominant natural sources of sound that define the soundscape itself. So that can include, various things such as trees and birds and grasses, animals if they're roaming, things of that nature. Topographical landmarks or landforms, sources of noise or recreation that may adversely impact the measurement or location or wilderness quiet parks certification status over time, and signs of garbage-built structures or evidence of human disturbance, not of wilderness character. Which should then be given an analysis to the day of the best conditions, which were free from inclement weather. So we're again looking for those 3 out of the 7 days, which are of the best conditions when we analyze. So data is analyzed again using that dual assessment of the wave file spectrogram and the acoustic data from the sound level meter. We'll compile this in this template as mentioned before. For more information on that, you can reach out to Matt. If additional testing is required, this is important, QPI will coordinate necessary reevaluation with the previous assessors and any personnel involved with the candidate wilderness quiet park, if applicable, will be notified. So if that is ever the case, if additional testing is needed, just reach out to us immediately and we'll work to help support what that retesting can look like. The most important element that hasn't been mentioned yet in terms of the status of award is that in that team of 2 to 3 individuals, over the 5-day period, there has to be a unanimous and unhesitant opinion that the space or the park, the location in general, is quiet, and that there cannot be any disagreement between any members of that group. What the QPI assessors may say in analyzing is generally trumped by whatever the individuals would say on site, or that what is said on site definitely adds more weight to what we would say in evaluating. But QPI is always open to potentially pushing back and providing comments where we may hear different things in those recordings and analysis. But the most important thing is that every person on site agrees that this is a quiet location. So once all of those things are boxes are checked and everything has been approved by the Quiet Parks International team, we move to then work with the land managers, stakeholders, and local community members to recognize and award the Wilderness Quiet Park. The proof of award will be showcased on the QPI website and Wilderness Quiet Park page. Awards are sometimes given on behalf of an organization, an individual, or a group of people who have played a vital role in the preservation of the area, not excluding, of course, yourselves as volunteers who've helped to assess and make that happen. And ideally, an award ceremony takes place nearby the newly awarded park, where the physical award is presented with hopefully you present, the executive director of the program, either there in person or virtually, to then bestow the award. So that is really Wilderness Quiet Parks in a nutshell, with the assessment aspect. So if there's any questions that you might have about really what's entailed, or if there's any other lessons that we've learned, I'd encourage you to put those in the chat section. We were going to dive into urban quiet parks, but looking at time, I do want to make sure that Nick has a chance to share some of his experience from quiet trails before we dive into the Q&A section, which I imagine there's going to be a number of questions. So I'm actually going to make the executive decision to skip urban quiet parks for this time and work with Ulf to find another set time to present some of this information. Ulf Bohman, who's our executive director of urban quiet parks. It's a very similar setup. I will note that there's one key difference between the way that we conduct those processes sections for urban quiet parks, and that's really this criteria. We're not looking at those noise-free intervals the same way we are with wilderness quiet parks. We are looking at maximum dBA, A-weighted decibel values for those measurement periods. There can't be Lmax values above 80 dBA, which if that is the case, the park would be disqualified and not eligible. We look at short noise disturbances allowed per hour when assessing. These have to be below 70 dBA. So that is essentially our noise-free interval exception for urban quiet parks. But elements like public transportation accessibility, safe to visitors, and any data that may exist currently for those urban parks, which in the case of certain countries and regions, there may actually be an abundance of soundscape data, since this field is burgeoning in various parts of Europe, Canada, and North America at the moment. So that's a key differentiator, but for the sake of time, I'm going to sort of breeze through this and pass it over to Nick now to share a bit more about his experience with our third program, Quiet Trails.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. I think you'll still have to, you can hear me all right? Yeah,
yes.
Okay, you'll still have to kind of change the slides. I think I just have about 5 photos from the Niobrara Trail, which is kind of the trail I'll mostly be talking about. And yeah, Quiet Trails is probably the newest and the most, well, the activity of it and the newness of it is generally newer than the wilderness and the urban quiet parks, which have been a little bit more established since 2019. And about a year and a half ago, Gordon and I took a trip down the river. Go to the river slide, called the Niobrara in Nebraska, and it was kind of our first. Well, Gordon was heading this at this time, and it was really the first kind of quiet trail concept. And so in assessing it, he did a lot of, you can see here, he's holding his D10 recorder, a lot of talking, narrating the experience. And we did a lot of just dialogue back and forth throughout the 4 days floating down this river. It's in Nebraska, and it was a very kind of remote place in its own way, although it has borders with agriculture zones and occasionally a road passing over. So we were kind of trying to determine how to bridge kind of the gap between a wilderness area, which is so pristine and uniquely quiet, to almost passing through somewhat more urban areas, places where people live, and you're passing by cars. But as you can see in the photos, it is also very um, visually quiet in many places, and we kind of focused in on that. Um, a good perspective that Gordon has helped me understand throughout these experiences is, while we are hearing noise at times from distant traffic or a tractor periodically, we aren't looking for noise. We're really looking for quiet. And this was definitely an experience of that. We were able to ask each other, numerous times throughout the trip, is this a quiet experience? As we got to different levels of sound within the river, or different levels of sound within distant human noises, we kind of were constantly checking in with each other. And that seemed to be a really important learning experience within this whole within this trail, and has kind of furthered the understanding now of kind of where we're at with how to determine a trail, is to be able to ask yourself, am I able to have a quiet experience along the way? I still think it has been really important for us to, and on this trip we did this, to record dawn and dusk, as those can be really kind of special times acoustically in any environment. Whether you're in the urban setting of a city waking up, and how does the noise kind of fill in the space, or whether you're in a quiet wilderness area, and are you hearing aircraft starting to pass over, or the distant sounds of um, whatever might be waking up, whether it's natural or non-natural sounds. Let's go to the next one. So this was a really unique place. We had at the time support from the land manager, which was the National Park Service, who kind of helped us through this trip. That fellow there is Gordon, as well, a different Gordon, and he has worked on the river, doing bird surveys and leading and guiding people on it for 20 plus years, and knew it very well. It's extremely helpful to have support of regional land managers in any way, whether they're just showing their support through email and communication, or whether they're actually there on the trip. When they aren't, it can be a little the time kind of can pass quite quickly as we look for who can support a place. And I guess I'm referring mostly to another trip in Hawaii, where we were testing a trail. Okay, and here's Gordon recording. So obviously important to be capturing those soundscapes on a trail just as much. But yeah, on this trip in Hawaii, we have been looking for basically regional support, and I think we're kind of at a place where we're reaching out to more locals to help us kind of go through the next steps in awarding this, because we were able to test it, we were able to walk the trail, and determine that it is an exceptionally quiet place, and will likely become a wilderness and trail awarded. But it's been an ongoing challenge for us to find support locally of that. And I think in general that can be a challenge for these more wilderness type areas. In the city and urban zones, there's almost always someone directly related to the parks, even from a government side of like Parks Department and different organizations. So these sort of like broader wilderness areas, it can be a little bit of a search that we've been going through in the last year or so, looking for that. So Haleakala is going to be a beautiful place to hopefully award as a quiet trail and quiet wilderness within the next year or so. And then very recently, we had a group of volunteers at this trail in Spain on a biking trip. And this trail is massive. It's like, I want to say 13 to 1500 kilometers, with small options that you can do, in a day, to spending multiple weeks riding around on this trail. And I will be talking to the volunteers this week about their experience, and super excited to hear about it. But just from what I've seen visually, in photos, it looks, really stunning. And I think that kind of about covers some of the quick assessment, and it'd be really great to hear, if people have some more questions about, the direct experience of testing and being out there looking for quiet and trying to dodge between sound places and loud places, or anything people might have.
I'll add too, just quickly before we move on from this slide too, that this bike trail was a great example of how we were able to leverage some volunteers in the European regions to help support and fund their assessment for this particular park. So this is very recent. This is within the past few weeks that we were able to support a volunteer in this case who would raise their hand to support. So yeah, just one example of how we can work together and make sure that you feel supported on the ground and can visit some of these really amazing candidate locations.
Yes, Ursula, thanks for joining.
Yeah, shout out Ursula. All right, so in closing, we wanted to open up some Q&A, thoughts, comments, questions. Any of you who've been in the field, have just listened in and thought, hey, there's actually maybe a few things that weren't missing that greatly impacted our assessment, or maybe any lessons learned, or things that really worked well too, based on some of the things that we have written down or have standardized so far. We'd love to open that up before we dive into what's kind of ahead of for us as an organization. So yeah, opening the floor. I know that we have a couple questions that came through the chat, so I'm happy to answer those, but want to just open it up to folks who feel comfortable going off mute to maybe share some thoughts. All right, John Morton had a few questions. If you're still on the line, if not, we can make sure that our answers get to you through the recording or elsewhere. But Matt, if you're still on the line, this might be interesting to answer from your perspective. But John asks, how does seasonality play in to a wilderness quiet park assessment? In Alaska, many are incredibly quiet during winter, but not so during the summer.
Yeah, I can definitely hop in, but a quick pause to hear some fighter jets flying over my house.
Nope, the Zoom noise control.
The Zoom noise reduction is so good. Wow, incredible. Yeah, that's a really good question, John. I've been to places that, during the winter are super quiet, and then during the summer are not. I think it's important we kind of like look at these areas as a whole. So for instance, if a place achieves a 15-minute noise-free interval during the winter, even if in summer it doesn't achieve that interval as frequently or as dependably, it should still be relatively quiet. So in the summer, it shouldn't be like an ATV off-road vehicle area, whereas in the winter it's closed down. So it's kind of important to look at all the information that we have from some of these places and kind of look at, how does the soundscape change with seasonality? Because all these places do change with the seasons. For instance, American Prairie Reserve, which is a place that Nick and I were able to visit back in 2021, is exceptionally quiet. The noise-free interval there is often measured in like hours and not minutes. Really, really beautiful, and very lots of solitude, very few people. However, during like 2 or 3 weeks of the fall, the hunting season happens, and there's a lot more people that come. You can hear ATVs, things like that. So for an area like American Prairie Reserve, what our goal is to kind of recognize the quiet there while also acknowledging, hey, there are times of year that aren't quiet. Avoid going during hunting season if you want to experience quiet, or avoid going during the winter because there's a snowmobile trail or something like that. We just kind of want to acknowledge that, yeah, quiet isn't necessarily universal all the time at every time of year in a lot of these places. So I think that's my basic rant on that. And Ethan or Nick, I don't know if you have any other things to add to that, or John, if you have any follow-up questions.
I would just briefly add that with the Niobrara River Trail in Nebraska, we've been warned that during the summer the river can become quite loud with people floating and partying on Friday and Saturdays, and enjoying the outdoors in a more noisy sort of way, which we do as people. And I think that part of these awards and part of trying to share this is also to just bring awareness and education to the greater public about the value of quiet and the value of listening to your environment. And so we don't necessarily, I don't think, from my opinion, don't necessarily think of it as an exception. Oh, we can make an exception here or there, but that we have to just acknowledge the reality of the noise that so many places do have. Even hearing chainsaws or occasionally aircraft flying over in Glacier National Park, which is one of the quietest places in the lower 48 states.
For sure. Maybe I'll also just add, John had a second question about, with these really large wilderness areas where we have, hundreds of thousands of acres sometimes, those areas, not all the park is all quiet all the time. But really what we need to find is just one place within the park that offers quiet. For instance, Nick was the one who did the testing in Glacier National Park. For those of you who don't know, Glacier National Park is like one of the most visited national parks in the park system here in the United States, and has a lot of like motorcycle rides and a ton of visitation and things. But there are certain corners of that park that do offer a really true quiet wilderness experience. So all we need to find is one place really within that park that offers that experience, in order to kind of recognize it.
Great. Well, hopefully that answers your question. John, if you have any other comments, feel free to chime in the chat.
Yeah, no, my question really had to do with, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting a lot of feedback here. Yeah, both of the questions are related. It's the temporal and spatial variation, in large systems. And I don't know. I appreciate that you guys are trying to get some rigor into how you measure this, and I'm just going to gently suggest that maybe down the road you could have some kind of a general rule of thumb for how best to average over space and time. To have grid the area into 10 cells and have a meter in each of the 10 cells and take the average over 10, or alternatively, if it's seasonality we're worried about, then have equal numbers in the winter versus summer and average them out and see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's a super good point, John. And I think this is something that Ethan and it feels like we spend hours talking about every week, is like, what's the ideal scenario? And it really is to be able to deploy hundreds of these sound logging meters all over these wilderness quiet parks. Because that's what's going to give us a really accurate representation of how noise travels in the areas, how frequent it is, what's the seasonality, how's the spatial dynamic working. And oftentimes it's like, I call up Nick and I'm like, hey, Nick, can you drive 10 hours to this place and set up some microphones and break out your sound level meter to kind of do some testing? So I think that's what we're hoping to grow into. And with enough funding in certain projects, we're able to do more of that kind of long-term testing, return trips, things like that. So it's a really good point that we want to work towards for sure. Yeah.
It's the grid approach is something that I should have prefaced at the start. My main job is in architectural acoustics, and using that grid is like a really important way to understand how sound fields work within rooms. Absolutely can be applied in the environmental acoustics assessment domain. And it's something that Matt and I are discussing with a forthcoming collaboration with Parks Canada pretty soon in assessing certain parks, future parks, and creating noise assessment criterias, and how groups like them and then QPI in the future can begin to standardize and assess the development of parks. So a grid system is actually, I'm thankful that you brought that up. That would be a really great way for us to
Yeah,
consider.
I just sent you a link to a paper that we did up here a few years ago with a grad student, Tim Mullett, who's now a ecologist over at Kenai Fjords National Park. Still does lots of sound monitoring, but we divided this huge 2 million acre refuge, National Wildlife Refuge, into 30 cells, a grid of 30 cells, and that's how we built the soundscape model. So I think you guys might appreciate it. Just sending it more as an FYI.
Totally. Definitely recommend others check that out. That looks really informative. Thank you. I know we were just talking about, we were answering your original question from the point of wilderness quiet and quiet trails. For urban quiet, as someone who's been doing a number of assessments of urban quiet here in New York City, seasonal differences are extraordinary with the soundscape, given that there is a minimum accepted allowance of some anthropogenic sound, given that you are in a metropolitan, in most cases, metropolitan setting, assessing soundscapes. So foliage plays a huge role in absorbing, scattering, and diffusing certain higher frequencies, which can be present with different types of landscape management, traffic, you name it, different types of sounds and noise in a city. So when I do urban quiet parks assessments, I focus on the late spring and early fall months, when foliage is present and before it's fallen from trees. So that's typically my approach there. It's more of a suggestion, but we are leaning towards standardizing that and understanding what seasonal differences look like in different regions, which if you come from a region where foliage is constantly present and there is no ideal time of the year to assess, then that's something that's worth bringing up with the relevant QPI executive director to discuss how assessment could be best applied. Great, and I lost my chat. Let's see if there's any other questions that came through. Pontus, you'd asked a good question about how audio files are assessed. And in this case, how in person you can hear the sound of an airplane, but that might not be present in your recordings using a handheld device.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why we ask for a dual assessment of sound pressure level data, especially with a calibrated sound level meter that can register at or below the human range of hearing, so at or below 20 hertz. That data is very honest, and we'll be able to, just through our experience of, some of our experiences of reviewing sound pressure level environmental acoustic data, be able to determine if airplane passes are occurring if you're logging at least a 1 second interval, or at most a 1 second interval, I should say. So that does show up quite well on acoustical logging devices. So that's why we stress the importance of the dual audio and acoustic assessment.
Okay, I'm not sure about what the dual assessment audio recording is, but maybe I can learn more about this somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be sure to send over our contact information so that maybe we can have a follow-up discussion.
That would be great. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, another note too is that I've noticed even when I'm recording with really, really high quality microphones, that sometimes recordings can lie to you, sometimes your ears can lie to you, and then sometimes the sound pressure level meter can occasionally lie to you, or it make you think that you're hearing things you're not, or it hears things that you think are things that are not really other things. So taking those notes kind of as you're in the space, just listening with your ears is really important, because I've listened to recordings I've taken where I'm sure that there's no noise whatsoever, and it sounds perfectly quiet, it's perfectly calm. And then I go back and listen to the recording and I can hear distant hum of something. And then vice versa. I've heard on my recordings noise that I did, or heard on my recordings quiet, but in person, when I look at my notes, I'm hearing those distant airplane passes or something like that. So it's important, like Ethan mentioned, that kind of multiple source approach where you're recording sound pressure level, but then you're also listening. So that way you can kind of verify across all those different kind of data collection techniques that yes, what you're hearing is quiet, or not. And then once you get good enough, like I think, I speak for Ethan and Nick here, that we've done this enough times now where we can open up the car door and start hiking down a trail, and within probably an hour tell you, is it quiet or is it not? Will it meet the criteria? Because we're just used to showing up and being able to listen. So as you spend more time outside listening, the easier it becomes to kind of be able to tell, like, oh, this is a no-go, this won't work, or oh, this really has a chance. So there is kind of this, and I see Ethan like bang his head on the wall when him and I talk about it. There's this like hard part to quantify about quiet, that we know quiet as we learn it better as humans, and that's sometimes hard to bring to these written standards that we also really need as an organization. So Ethan's job is very difficult, and you're doing a great job, Ethan.
Oh, well, wasn't fishing for that, but I guess the one of my main takeaways too with all of this is, while quiet is indeed relative, especially for many of you who, like me, live in an urban center, that relativity is difficult to quantify and then present in the larger definitions or understandings of quiet that QPI is attempting to standardize and assess against, which for finding the quietest place in New York City, which has been sort of my mission since joining QPI 2 years ago, it's been very difficult because we get these amazing tips from people, really esteemed figures in the community, to go to different parks, and while they are indeed like really transporting, and you have a hard time imagining that Times Square is only a few miles north of where you are. It still doesn't make the cut for a few of some of these like more clear-cut reasons, with noise-free intervals and proximity to airports and transportation hubs. So it is a challenging thing, and I would say that I don't want to talk down to anyone on the call. We're all experienced in this realm, but it is a muscle. It's something like the auditory system is a part of our ergonomics, musculoskeletal system. It's something that involves training, and it's something that I think many of us at QPI are like forever students in. We're trying to understand like what our definitions of quiet are going to be different than our representatives and board members in Taiwan or in Southeast Asia and northern Sweden and places like that. So it yields really interesting and fun conversations about the future of what preservation of quiet really means. So I'll leave it at that before I go down a rabbit hole of how exciting this all is. But it's a good segue, I guess, into some of the future QPI assessment categories. Some of them are already active. You'll find some of these pages on our website related to quiet stays, hotels, retreat centers, quiet communities and residences, neighborhoods, different collective areas of where people will dwell. Some new areas that I've been looking into at the executive director level are quiet spaces. Some of these could be public, like cultural institutions, museums that have quiet offerings or designed using architectural features that promote quiet, or sacred spaces. And Ursula, I saw that you noted about this as well, the theme of archaeoacoustics and understanding how quiet exists in heritage, which is a part of the broader theme of heritage acoustics or archaeoacoustics. So something to study as we find the links between, say, the spread of culture, the spread of religion, and the desire to be in places of quiet or refuge. So that's sort of a burgeoning field for QPI. We have existing programs such as quiet conservation areas. We have some recent awardees on that front, which we can discuss maybe in a later volunteer meetup to learn more about. This has less to do with existing quiet and more to do with management protocols for establishing or maybe even promoting the reduction of noise levels in given communities or trails or parks. And quiet education, which has nothing to do with awards or certification, has everything to do with how we collect all of our thoughts as thought leaders and experts and practitioners to share with communities who are curious about engaging with the natural environment from a sonic and tranquility and peaceful understanding of how our impact as humans relates to the overall soundscapes we experience. So just a lot more to come. I'm super excited to continue working with all of you. And if you have any questions as we continue to roll out these guidelines of assessment criteria, I'm always happy to be a resource. The various directors are always happy to be resources as well if you're curious about any one of our programs. And yeah, that's all I've got for you guys. So thank you so much for dialing in. This has been a real treat, and it's great to hear from all of you too about what's working and what isn't, and any research that maybe you and your teams have been up to in this space. So don't be a stranger, keep in touch. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you.
And this should be available, I believe, on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends and colleagues.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Matt.
All right. Have a good one.
Have a good one too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.